Okay, so we are on page 36b, and yesterday we spoke about mainly two things. Number one was the bracha on pilpuli, on this peppercorns, and we mentioned that there's an argument, a big argument between the rabbis. What bracha should the peppercorns themselves be? We did have in the Gemara a discussion of the bracha, but the Gemara's discussion talked about if they're dry. And on that, we said the final halacha is that you don't recite a bracha on dry peppercorns. But on fresh ones, that we said is a discussion among the commentaries of what bracha would be recited on the fresh ones. Now, logically, because they grow on a vine, and because our Gemara says that they're obligated in Orla, in keeping the rule of the 3 years, it would make sense to say that they are ha'etz, bayre pri ha'etz. So if you want to just learn it simply, it would seem like it should be the bracha ha'etz. However, the many commentaries say it's ho'adama. It's you say the blessing fruit from the vine. And the explanation that we mentioned yesterday is that because the reason why it's planted is really for the spice, not to be eaten.
Remember.
And because of that, it loses its title of being fruit from the tree. In other words, the claim to fame of the peppercorns is not that it itself is a fruit eaten as a fruit. Its claim to fame is really being a spice after it's dry. That's its real claim to fame. So to give it this title of this is the fruit from the tree, no, this is not exactly what you would call the fruit from the tree when you're eating it, not in its normal fruit way, not in its normal purposeful way, I should say. And therefore it loses its bracha ha'etz. It's not the real, this is not the real purpose of the tree. But since some people do eat it that way, and they have in mind that there are going to be some people who are going to be eating it that way in its fresh state, therefore it's still considered a produce of the ground, but it's not like the primary fruit of the tree, and therefore you would not say bayre pri ha'etz according to those opinions. And of course, because there's an argument, so we've got to try to fulfill all views. How do you fulfill all views? Well, the blessing, bayre pri ha'adama, it is a blessing that encompasses not only fruits of the ground, which means vegetables, but it also encompasses in scenarios where you need it to include fruits of the tree. It also includes fruits of the tree, because even fruits of the tree are grown ultimately from the ground, because the tree itself grows from the ground. So therefore, the bracha bayre pri ha'adama can cover bayre pri ha'etz in scenarios where it's needed to cover it. In other words, if you by mistake recited a bracha bayre pri ha'adama on your apple, you have fulfilled your obligation. You do not need to recite another bracha, because you said a bayre pri ha'adama on your apple. It covers fruit of the tree, but the opposite doesn't work. If you said a bayre pri ha'etz on your celery or on your carrot, and you say bayre pri ha'etz, fruit of the tree, that you would need to recite another bracha, because it doesn't work both ways. It only works the vegetables, the blessing for vegetables also covers the blessing for fruits, but not vice versa. And so therefore, in this case of pilpuli, you would recite the bracha on the bayre pri ha'adama to fulfill all views. This way you would definitely have fulfilled the obligation of a bracha. In any event, we also talked about person eating on eating these peppercorns on Yom Kippur. And it's interesting. I did see one of the commentaries mentions that we discussed that there's two views. Of course, we mentioned that the most understandable view, the common view, is the view of Maimonides, that even though you might be, you don't get the punishment for eating this peppercorns on Yom Kippur if they're dry, but you would, it would be prohibited to do. But we did have a opinion of the Rav Yah, who said that you're even allowed to eat them in the first place, these peppercorns. Again, they're not really edible, but and you don't recite a bracha on it. But the question is, would you be allowed to eat it on Yom Kippur? Now, what I did see was, I think it was along the lines of what Ben wanted to say yesterday, and that is that there is a Sfas Emes that mentions that even though you're not obligated, because it's not considered a food that satisfies satisfies one's mind, but nevertheless it would be prohibited biblically from eating it, because you're supposed to be paining yourself. And this is not considered paining yourself, because you are ruining the inui. Inui means to pain oneself, because you're eating foods that aren't fit to be eaten until you're satisfied. And what you're ruining is the obligation to pain oneself. You're sort of transgressing that obligation. So he understands that even though maybe it wouldn't be considered an eating, but it is considered a transgression of transgressing the fact that one should pain themselves. In other words, there is some type of a potential satiation that's happening. There is some type of you are minimizing your pain by eating them. Some type of sustenance is you are having from these items. And because of that, so it would be prohibited biblically from eating them. Now, I'm not sure if he's explaining the reason of the Rambam, but that might explain the Rambam, which the Rambam had said that it's biblically that it's prohibited, but you don't get the punishment of the licorice, of being cut off. So according to the Sfas Emes, it's still prohibited, as the Rambam says. But the Sfas Emes is claiming that it's biblical. I don't know. I wonder if the Rambam in chapter 2, halacha 6, the Rambam in the laws of Shvisas Osir, which is the laws of Yom Kippur, in chapter 2, in halacha 6, so he talks about it putter. If a person drank vinegar mixed with water, he's chayiv. But if he ate these pilpulin, which is these dried znagbil, yavesh, dried peppercorns, or dried ginger, he is putter. And that implies it is putter but prohibited. But he doesn't clarify if it's prohibited biblically or rabbinically. But it would seem like this would explain that Rambam, that why would it be, if you're exempt, why is it prohibited? And the answer is because you're still getting some sustenance from it, and that's transgressing the law of inui, of paining oneself. So anyway, that gives a little insight. I think Ben said something along those lines. And so thank you, Ben. We found a little source over there. The other thing that I wanted to touch upon is is, well, we're going to talk about ginger now. So let's go do it inside. Let's go inside the Gemara. We are going to start about 8 or 9 lines from the bottom of the page of 36b. Kos znagbila. I'm sorry, Amri Le. A few words before that. Amri Le Rabbanan L'Merema. The rabbis told Merema, how could Rabbah say that kos nagbila, if a person chewed and ate ginger, b'yoyma de Kippuri, on Yom Kippur, Hatter, he's exempt. How could Rabbah say that? V'ha Amar Rabbah, in other words, that was something we learned about 5 lines earlier, that Rabbah said if you chew a pepper or a ginger on Yom Kippur, you're Pater, you're exempt. And the Gemara is asking, rabbis asked Merema, how could Rabbah have said such a thing? V'ha Amar Rabbah, doesn't Rabbah say, hi Hemalta, this Hemalta is a some type of a paste, mixture of ginger, ground ginger with honey. And so this Hemalta is the Asya Mibei Hinadoi, which comes from Bei Hanadoi, which is a place Rashi says called Kushiim, which we normally translate as Ethiopia, but there are sources that term refers to India. So it's either from Ethiopia or India, so that they make this paste that's a mixture of honey and ginger. Sharia, it is permissible to eat, and you don't have to worry about 2 kashrus problems. What are the 2 kashrus problems? 2 problems with regard to it maybe not being kosher. So one problem could be, in other words, what would be non-kosher in the honey and in the ginger? So one problem could be that it is cooked by a non-Jew. We're not allowed to eat food cooked by a non-Jew, called bishul akum. And these, there could be, it comes non-kosher. You're not allowed to eat it. And the rabbis have to deal, when they have big companies, how do they get around this problem of bishul akum? You have a big company owned by non-Jews. So the way they get around it is the rabbi turns on the oven. And that means he's the one cooking it. Even though the chef is non-Jewish and mixing the food and switching things around, but the burner is started by the rabbi. The rabbi turns on or lights the pilot light, and that makes it that it's considered that a Jew was involved in the cooking, and that's one way. There's other ways, of course, if there's a rabbi on staff. So the rabbi on staff, a lot of bakeries have a rabbi on staff, or restaurants. There's a rabbi on staff that he's the only one who's allowed to turn on the fire. And so that is one of the issues that could be a problem of having this ginger and honey mixture. Could be a problem of bishul akum. And the other problem is the obvious problem. And what is that? Of having the non-kosher in the pots and pans might be non-kosher. It's called giyulei nachri. Giyulei nachrim. Which means the inside the pot, the tastes that are in the walls of the pot could give over flavor to the food. So if you cook pig in a pot, and then you use that same pot to make your coffee, even if you wash it out, the coffee is not going to be the highest quality coffee, because it's going to have a little flavor maybe not so much, but will have a little from that pig or from that meat that's non-kosher, or from if you put in something else that's non-kosher, shellfish, and it's going to give off a flavor into your coffee. So you would it wouldn't be so, unless you don't care about your coffee, but a lot of people are very careful to have a very good tasting coffee. You wouldn't want to use a pot that has something else, that has that flavor. It's going to give off a little flavor. Now, that flavor is prohibited. It's prohibited. It's considered eating non-kosher. You have a flavor in your food. Now, what do you do if it ever happens that there is a pot that was non-kosher and it cooked, food was cooked in it by mistake? So there are ways of having a non-Jew taste it to see if any flavor got in to the food. Or if you know there's 60 times as much of the food item than of the non-kosher. For example, let's say a teaspoon of non-kosher was cooked in this pot before, and now you're cooking over 60 teaspoons of something else. So the only issue would be that 1 teaspoon of non-kosher that was cooked in this pot beforehand, that teaspoon could have been absorbed into the walls of the pot. And now you're going to be getting from that 1 teaspoon flavor. And so if it's 60 times as much, that would be a way of being exempt from worrying about that. But here we're dealing with ginger and honey. And we have 2 issues. One is either bishul akum, being cooked by a non-Jew, and the other is having flavors from non-kosher food. Yes, Avram. Yeah, you're muted. You're muted.
As far as flavors being absorbed in the pot, there's an interesting scientific discovery is that that backs it up, is that archaeologically they wondered if the civilizations like Neolithic, I think was, like existed 1,000 years ago, they knew that they farmed crops. They didn't know whether they're domesticating animals. So while doing excavation, they got a little bit of pottery about 1/4 of an inch long, and they put it under a microscope and found that it had deposits of milk in there, and it realized that they did domesticate animals. So thousands of years ago, it still retained its milk. It was extraordinary.
There were, I didn't really understand what you said. It sounds very interesting, like a discovery. Could you explain it one more time?
Yeah, they weren't sure whether a Neolithic civilization, which is really, they were just hunting gatherers or whatever. They did a degree of agriculture. They didn't know whether they domesticated animals or not. So when they found this little bit of pottery, about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch long, they put it under a microscope and found it had deposits of milk in there all those years later.
Wow.
So they realized that they actually domesticated animals and were drinking the milk, which improved their whole health. So it just shows you.
Wow.
That can last thousands of years. And obviously it wasn't a varnish pot, it was earthenware,
Now, you're saying, but are you saying it was in the walls of the earthenware?
Yes. I believe it was in. Yeah, it must have been, because it would have been worn off by all those years if it was on the surface.
So it's in the walls. So it's very interesting, especially because earthenware is considered like the worst container regarding kosher issues, and because it absorbs and you can never get anything out of it.
Right.
You can never be guaranteed to get out of earthenware. So that's
thousands
really
of years later.
Yeah, very interesting. Wow, thank you so much, Avram. Yes, Susan.
The thing about earthenware is that it's not glazed. In other words, it's like raw pieces of pottery that they're cooking in. They've only been fired one time. But
Uh-huh.
those societies, they baked them not in a click kiln, but in the sun.
Uh-huh.
So they're porous.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
that's why that when Avram was saying that, I was like, oh my God, he's absolutely right. That porous material retained whatever was cooked.
Right. I think even in a kiln, it still stays somewhat porous because,
Not if you glaze it a second time.
well, maybe if you glaze it. Uh-huh.
When you glaze it, that's actually glass that you're baking on the pottery.
Uh-huh.
And
Interesting.
it completely covers the pottery and doesn't allow anything else to be absorbed in or out.
Uh-huh.
I was a
Uh-huh.
potter when I was in college.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Edith, do you want to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
sometimes you can't get the smell out of stainless steel pots either. So
Uh-huh.
you think that you're koshering it, but if you don't get rid of the smell, I thought then, is it kosher? If
Uh-huh.
the smell is still there?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. If you're saying there is some smell, a flavor that's going to go into the food. And you're saying even if you use the method of koshering, it still stays, like, for example, boiling the pot over.
Yeah, even boiling it a couple of times. I tried it on something, on a pot, and I didn't feel satisfied that it was kosher.
Well, wow, that is interesting. So you had a non-kosher pot that you had gotten, let's say, and you wanted to kosher it, and you still felt there's a flavor. And was it totally clean on the outside and on all surface?
Yeah.
100% clean.
Right.
That's very interesting that you couldn't get the
Right.
flavor.
Then now when I brought it up, somebody said, oh, I should have used baking soda. It gets rid of the smells, but I didn't know that then.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess you're right. I guess it would be a problem if you know you're if you're saying that it definitely still had some
smell.
But the only question I guess, which is we would have to ask maybe someone who specializes in this field of koshering, would be that number one is the rule, once you kosher it, whatever smell is afterwards, it's not considered a non an issue, like a non-kosher smell, because it's already old and it's been kosher. In other words, does koshering sort of exempt you from worrying any further? Or whatever koshering does, it ruins it to the extent that's necessary. Is that good enough, or does it really need to be totally removed? I guess that would be a question to ask someone who specializes in the laws of kashrus. But yeah,
interesting. I'm going to ask further.
Yeah, that was something to look into. But I'm just wondering if there's maybe a lip around it. Maybe stuff could have gotten in the lip around. I mean, that is
the handles. Maybe the handles.
It was from the inside.
Now, the other question is it possible that the non-kosher foods are definitely cleansed by the koshering process? Other foods, like let's say a very sharp food, they are not non-kosher. So, for example, you might have sharp foods, but they wouldn't be for example, a person has certain spices, garlic. They cook a lot of garlic in their pot, so you might not be able to get the garlic flavor out. But the garlic itself, would we say that the garlic flavor, in other words, those strong flavors are not really non-kosher? It's the non-kosher that we're trying to get out, and that may be the koshering process works for. But it's not so simple what I'm saying, because there are situations where we would say that the entire item becomes the entire. Well, I have to look into it. It's definitely an interesting question, but that's nice to know that you were not satisfied with the koshering. A lot of people would have said, "Oh, I did it. It's good enough." So that's very nice to know that you were not satisfied. That's we can all eat in your house, Edith.
Oh, thank you.
Very nice. Okay, so we're going back to the Gemara here, and we mentioned that Rava says that there's a hemalta that comes from Bei Hanadoi. And what is hemalta? It's this this type of like a therapeutic paste or medicine or mixture. And it says it's sharia. It's permissible. We don't have to worry about these two issues. And the reason why we don't have to worry about these two issues is because, number one, items that are eaten raw, you don't have to worry about bishul akul. You don't have to worry if a non-Jew cooks it. So, for example, applesauce. Apples are eaten raw. So applesauce is cooked, but because apples are eaten raw, as far as I understand, applesauce does not need to be bishul yisrael. It doesn't have to be cooked by a Jew. You would be allowed to have bishul akum applesauce. Why? Because apples are an item that's eaten raw. So anything that's eaten raw, even if it's cooked, you don't have to worry about the non-Jew cooking it.
Salmon.
Sushi.
Now, when sushi came out, that created a whole big question. Because once people started eating sushi, they started questioning the fact that we are so careful on, we're so careful. I mean, salmon would be the ultimate case of salmon, fish, meat. These are serious foods that bishul akum should apply to. These are, honorable. They're food that's fit for a king, and the bishul akum laws should apply to them. And so it created a whole question: what happens now that people eat raw fish? Does that minimize the obligation of? Does that remove the obligation of having fish bishul yisrael, having fish cooked by a Jew? So it's something that you'll find on the internet. There definitely are some discussions about it. I've seen people discussing it. I've seen articles about it, but the common understanding I have is that we still are careful on fish that's cooked, that it should be cooked by a Jew. I'm not exactly sure how it works with the salmon. I know I've seen things written like salmon, sushi is a very high quality, and that's why it's eaten raw. And if it's not such a high quality, you wouldn't be able to eat it raw. And the salmon we get is not that high quality, and therefore you would have to have it cooked. You'd have to have it cooked by a Jew because it's a whole different type of salmon. I don't know. I'm not sure. Then I asked a few people who make sushi. They told me, yeah, it's the same stuff. It's not it's no different. So that reason didn't seem to work. But it's definitely something of a topic of discussion that they talk about. I personally am careful for fish that it has to be not only salmon and raw fish, but even like canned fish. Although there are some leniencies with canned fish, but I follow the strict view that even tuna should be bishul yisrael, and I haven't been convinced yet to be lenient.
Vegetable soup.
So vegetable soup, I mean, it depends. If it's vegetables that are eaten raw, then it's not a problem, right? But if it's not, if they're not eaten raw,
my wife eats everything raw.
Anyway, we'll have to look into some of these things if you want to look into it. That would be good homework if anyone wants to check out some of these things. That would be something. It doesn't depend on you personally, by the way. If you eat it raw, it depends on the if it's commonly eaten raw. But you know, so there are leniencies for certain foods. You know, one of the big leniencies that people, what's the reason? Why are we careful not to have food cooked by a non-Jew? What's so bad about that? So the main reason is that we are afraid that if you can have food cooked by a non-Jew, you're going to socialize much more in non-Jewish households, because you're going to end up, you know, you'll eat their food. And if you can eat their food, you'll socialize with them. And then your children might end up marrying their children, or you might end up marrying their children. Ultimately, it'll lead to marriage, intermarriage. And therefore, a person, these are prohibitions and offenses around the Torah that a person shouldn't end up, you know, in such a situation. So therefore, if you don't eat food that's cooked by a non-Jew, it'll cause some type of separation between you and the non-Jews, and therefore it won't lead to, you know, it'll limit that potential hazard of intermarriage. Now the thing is, nowadays you could ask that, you know, a lot of the canned foods, all the foods that are made in these big companies, packaged foods, you know, they're made in big companies. You never get to know the person who's cooking it. So there is a leniency, but the rabbis don't want to rely on this leniency at all. But there was a thought that maybe there could be a leniency, and I'm just sharing it with you so that you're aware that there is that it has been discussed. You know, that the fact is that the foods, it's not like you're going to develop any relationship with the person who cooked it, because you're never going to know who lives in the Heinz Kraft company. You know, that these big companies, you're never going to know who cooked the food. So how is it going to cause intermarriage if you have food that's cooked by some big company who you're never going to know the person who cooked it, and you're never going to develop any relationship with them? So eating, you know, food cooked by a non-Jew in their house, you know, that you might get to know them personally. Go to a restaurant, there's a non-Jew cooking right there in front of you, and you're schmoozing, you could schmooze with the person. That would be a problem. But if you're buying a packaged food, there could, you know, it has been discussed that could be different. The problem is that when the rabbis made the decree, they didn't make any exceptions. So once they made the decree of the rules of having, you know, food cooked by a non-Jew, so because of that, you can't rely on this. You could say it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to packaged foods. It does apply, because when the rabbis made the rule, they didn't make this exception. If you buy packaged foods made in a big company where you'll never get to know anyone who's in the chefs of these big companies, the rabbis made a rule: you can't have food cooked, you know, baked by a non-Jew, cooked by a non-Jew, and that's it. And so it's sort of like a blanket rule, and so therefore it would apply. And the rabbis don't want to rely on this exception, because it doesn't really fit. Because this exception would only fit if the rabbis made a rule that said only when it's, you know, when the rabbis established the rule, if they made such an exception. But since when they made it more in a blanket rule that it's like always you cannot eat food baked by cooked by a non-Jew. So therefore it would apply even in big companies, and you're not going to get to know the person who turned on the flame or cooked the food. You still would have to keep this law. Yes, Ben.
On the canned foods, I always look for the OU symbol.
Right. So the fact that there's an OU means two things. It means, number one, that there's a rabbi that says that this food is either exempt, it's kosher, and it's either exempt from worrying about a non-Jew cooking the food, or it has a Jew cooking it. That's what the OU is telling you. That the OU is saying the rabbis at the OU are saying, we have a reason to be lenient on this food item, and therefore it's okay for you to eat, even if it's not cooked by a Jew. or they claim that or they have a rabbi that's actually turning on the fire. So that's what the OU means. Now, the person who wants to be extra strict will be more careful and say, I don't want to rely on the leniencies of the OU with regard to their, they might have certain policies and opinions that they're relying on, views that are acceptable. If the OU, if there's an OU, it is acceptable. But you don't have to, you might want to take a stricter view. So again, there are OU, let's say OU tuna. There's many tunas that the OU gives a hechsher on. They give their symbol. Personally, I don't like to rely on the leniency that they have, that the tuna, they have a leniency that the tuna that is in a can is a very low quality tuna. It's not fit for a king. On a king's table, you would have a tuna steak, right? But you wouldn't have a low quality tuna in a can mixed with mayonnaise. They're not going to serve that at a king's, in a king's dinner. They're not going to serve it at a wedding. You're not going to get tuna fish, salad. So they have a leniency because it's not fit for a king's table. You don't have to worry about bishul akum. You can have food because I think the idea is that if you're going to eat this at your friend's house and it's not fit, it's not a fancy food, it's not going to get you to get closer to them because they're giving you some garbage tuna. But if they give you a nice tuna steak, then you might start getting friendly with them, and you might get close and say, wow, this is a good chef. I like her, So that would be that would be another exception to the rule if it's not fit for a king's table, and so therefore, tuna fish would be a case where you could rely on that leniency. They say the same thing about cereal. Cereal has a leniency if it's not fit. It's not fit for a king's table. You don't serve cereal at a fancy meal. But some people are more strict and they'll say no, but flour is used for fancy foods, and tuna is used just because this is in a can and it's ground up and it's not in a nice steak form, but tuna is a food that is eaten at a king's table. Just because now it's in a different form doesn't ruin it, and therefore I want to be strict for it to have tuna baked or cooked by a Jew, and therefore I am careful for tuna that even if it has an OU, I'm not satisfied with that. I would like it to have Bishul Yisrael written on it, because I would like that a Jew actually cooked it, because I like to be more careful. And some people are careful with cereals, and therefore they don't eat the regular Kellogg's or whatever companies out there, but they eat they'll eat the kosher brands, because the kosher brands have a special symbol called Bishul Yisrael that writes on it. And you'll see also some tunas are going to write Bishul Yisrael. And therefore there are areas where you could be more strict, even though the OU says it's fine, and they're right. If they say it's fine, it's acceptable. There's no question. They have opinions, halachic opinions that they're relying on. That's acceptable. Doesn't mean you have to follow. You have to be lenient if you don't want to. Yes, Susan.
This thing with tuna, that this is all rabbinic, what you're talking about?
Yeah, Bishul Akum is a rabbinic law.
Because I don't eat tuna from a can ever because of the mercury content. I don't care if it's farm raised or wild caught. I do not eat tuna.
Right. Okay. So you get out of the problem.
Exactly.
But if you ever eat a tuna steak, tuna steaks, they all have it. The mercury. Okay. Right. All right. Well, in any event, but this would apply to like salmon steak or something. You could, you would have, you would want it to be Bishul Yisrael, cooked by a Jew, because it's a food that's cooked. And okay, in any event, so getting back to what we're talking about here, the reason why we don't have to worry about himalto. This is himalto, which is this paste that's made of ginger and and honey is that we don't have to worry about being cooked by a non-Jew because ginger is edible raw. And we don't have to worry, and we don't have to worry about the pans or the pots that this is either cooked in or it's cut with and so on. Why not? Because they generally use their special set aside utensils for these type of foods, because otherwise it would give it a bad flavor. And therefore these specific foods, they're careful to set aside specific utensils. So even though this is cooked in a non-Jewish place, it is kosher, hemalta. Now, this hemalta, it says, is not a problem. But the question that the Gemara has is that we just said that you could even eat this nagbila, this ginger, on Yom Kippur, because not a food. And here we're saying that not only is it it's edible, it's called hemalta, and it's permissible, it's considered kosher, and you don't have to worry about the umavarchan alei bar pri adama. You even say a bracha bar pri adama. You say a blessing on this hemalta. So obviously it's edible. So why would you be exempt if you ate it on Yom Kippur? So the Gemara answers, like kasha habarativta habiyabeshta. The difference is, like we answered before about the pilpul and about the peppercorns. That's the difference if it's fresh or if it's dry. If it's fresh, then it's edible. If it's dry, then it's not considered edible. And Teves over here talks about a number of different foods that are considered like they're similar because they are spices. What would be the law on eating different spices? And one of them, which would be a good question, would be, what about cinnamon? Would you recite a bracha on cinnamon? What about cloves? What about nutmeg? So in this Teves, Retiva, he deals with these issues. He says that a person would recite Bari Priho Adama on this litavri, which is this same thing as Himalta, which the Gemara spoke about. But he says if it's dry, you would not recite a bracha on it. It's only if it's fresh and moist. Then he says that znagbila, ginger, and cloves, it's not usual to eat them, only if they're fresh, if they're moist, but not if they're dry. And if they're dry, you don't say any bracha at all. What about cinnamon? And he says that cinnamon, you would recite a bracha, Bari Priho Adama. You would recite the bracha, Bari Priho Adama, because people eat it even if it's dry. Cinnamon, people eat, and you would recite the bracha as a fruit from the ground, and it also grows on the earth. Now, Teves then says, what about sugar? Which I think he means sugar cane. Sugar cane, you would recite, and this is a big discussion, what bracha is sugar cane? Because sugar cane, you're actually eating I think it's the actual trunk of the tree, and it wouldn't be like, it's not really the fruit. On the other hand, it is sort of like the fruit, because that's what people plant it for that sugar inside.
But you eat only the inside part. You don't eat the bamboo part of it.
Right. Okay.
The klipa.
Right. Well, Teves says it's Bari Pri Ha'etz. You would recite a Bari Pri Ha'etz on it. But I believe others argue, and let me just pull up over here the tour. He brings a lot of these items here, and Val HaSukar on sugar. The Bahag writes Bari Pri Ha'etz. The Rambam says that it's something that they squeeze. Mm-hmm. And then they cook it until it hardens, and then it turns into like similar to salt. They grind it into sugar. So he writes, all the Go'ainim, all the great scholars wrote that you say Ber Pri Ha'adama, different than the Bahag who writes Ha'etz, and Taisus over here writes Ha'etz. And some say Ber Pri Ha'etz. So he brings these different opinions about sugar.
Rabbi?
Sugar cane. Yes.
I mean, I remember back when I was young, we used to, sugar cane was taken and basically squeezed, and you got the fluid from the sugar cane, and that's what you drank. So if I'm assuming that if you're chewing on the sugar cane, it's probably Boy Priyates, because it's actually coming from the tree, but wouldn't the fluid itself, wouldn't it just be shahakol in that particular situation? If you're just drinking the fluid that comes from the tree.
I think they discuss it. I think it's a topic of discussion. I don't think it's clear. Let me just take a look here in the tour. Now, the Torah himself writes that even on the actual, it's not called a fruit, and you would say shahakol, because it's just similar to dvash tamarim, like honey from dates that you say shahakol on it. So he wants to say the same thing would be the sugar, the sugar cane itself, even but then and I'm sorry, the Torah himself doesn't write that. That is from the Rambam, and then the Torah argues and says you could argue and say there's a difference, because tamarim, the dates, they are fruits. People plant it to eat them, and therefore, when it turns into a liquid, it turns into honey that pours out of the dates. That is not exactly the fruit that was planted for. But these are bamboos. They're not fit to eat. The whole purpose of the planting is for this sugar, this honey. So this is its fruit, and therefore you should even recite a ha'etz. Now, if that's so, the question is, are they planting it only for the sugar part or for the liquid part? I think there's a discussion about the actual liquid, but I'll look into it. It's not. I'm not going to look into it now. But then Teves also brings a. So Teves calls it an eight tree, which it's Bari Priya eights, and then he says nutmeg. You would say Bari Priya eights, which people also eat that dry. So I don't know if these are commonly people eat them nowadays like this, but the Teves who lived, many hundreds of years before us, maybe in the 1300s, 1200s.
They're spices. I use cinnamon in my coffee.
No,
dry cinnamon, but they're all very good.
No, I'm wondering about eating them alone and dry. In other words, ginger, they said no one would eat. Peppercorns, no one's eating, but they said at least the dry ones. But he says nutmeg people would, and cinnamon, and you recite a bracha on it, even dry. Okay, so that was Teves. Now we're going to start. We have a few minutes. Let's begin the next Gemara over here. The next Gemara talks about mezainos, the law of Beirei Mine mezainos. So the Gemara says, Chavetz Kedera. Chavetz Kedera is a food that's a mixture of flour, honey, and oil. And the question is, what bracha do you recite on this? Flour, honey, and oil. So the Gemara then says v'chein, and also daisa. Daisa is grits. It's not ground up wheat, but it's pounded wheat into pieces. So you have grits and chavetz kedera. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shahako. Rabbi Yehuda says Shahako niya b'dvaroi. Rav Kahana Amar bayri mina mezainos. Rav Kahana says you recite mezainos. Now, why would Rabbi Yehuda say Shahako? This is like a porridge type of mix. You have flour and honey and oil. You would think that it should be a mezainos, right? Seems more logical to say mezainos because that would be the food is probably mainly the flour, and you have a little flavor. It's like cake, right? Cake, you would say mezainos, or this is that porridge. It's like porridge that's flavored, the maple oatmeal, right? It's a flavored. You have a flavor. The main thing is the food part, the food content, the flour. So why does he say shahako? So the Gemara says, "B'daisa greda kuli alma like pligi debari min mezainos." Regular grits, everyone agrees, would be mezainos. Ki pligi, when do we argue? B'daisa kein chavetz kedera. When you have daisa grits that are like chavetz kedera, which means that you put in honey. You have a mixture of honey and these grits. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shahakol, Rabbi Yehuda says the bracha would be Shahakol. Savar, he holds, Duvsha Iker. The main thing is the honey. Rav Kahana Amar, Rav Kahana says, you say the bracha for creating foods of sustenance. Savar Smida Iker. He holds the flour is the main ingredient. Amar Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, Kavosei de Rav Kahana mistabra. It would make sense like Rav Kahana says. The Rav Kahana said the mezainos bracha. And Rabbi Yosef says it's logical that Rav Yosef says that Rav Kahana's statement, opinion is more logical. Why? Because the Rav Shmuel, Amri Tarvayu, because of a statement of Rav and Shmuel, that they both say, Kol sheyesh by mechameshes haminim, anything that has from the 5 types, mevarchan olav bayre mine mezainos, you would recite on the on this anything that has from the 5 types of grains, you would recite bayre mine mezainos, and these daisa and chavetz kedera, they have from the 5 grains. Therefore, it would be bayre mine mezainos. Doesn't matter what else is added. You have honey in it as well, but it doesn't matter.
What if it's milk?
Instead of what?
Instead of water. You use milk, like in farina. When you cook farina, kashe, you cook it with milk. Then you put cinnamon on top of it, or chocolate chips, or whatever.
So what do you think would be the main ingredient in that food?
Probably milk and the grain itself.
So the milk is one of the main foods.
Yeah, there's a lot of milk going into it.
So this is the understanding of this Gemara is that you have to keep in mind, in general, we follow the logic of whatever is the main ingredient. Ikar and tafel, right? There's a main ingredient, and then there's side ingredients, secondary ingredients. So the primary item is the main reason why you're eating it. And the secondary ingredients give a little flavor, make it more enjoyable, and so on. And so that, in general, is the rules with brachas.
The main would be the grain, because
so the main would be the grain
that you can cook with milk. Yeah.
Now, the thing is that Rav and Shmuel here tell us that when it comes to grains, the 5 grains, and that 5 grains are, wheat and barley, wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. Those are the 5 grains. Wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. So those 5 grains, they break the rules. And it doesn't matter if something else is the primary. If they are in the food, they become the primary. That's what Rav and Shmuel are telling us, that even though under normal circumstances, when you have a mixture of, salad with, you have tomatoes and cucumbers and lettuce, and you have a few pieces of avocado. So avocado is ha'etz, and all the rest of the salad is ha'adama. So in that salad, the main thing is the ha'adama. You have a few pieces of ha'etz that are going to be eaten with it. The primary would be the ha'adama. That would be, you would say the bracha on the primary, and that would include these small pieces of avocado that you cut up. And also you have a few raisins in it, or whatever, you put in some craisins, let's say, so that they would be, they would be included in the ha'adama, because the primary is the ikar, and this becomes the tafel. There's the ikar, the primary, and then you have the secondary. However, here we're dealing with grain. When it comes to grain, it overrides. And so one way of understanding our Gemara is that you're eating this food for the honey, because you really like honey and you really enjoy something real sweet. And the majority is honey. And you put some of the grain in it. There's some grain, you have the grits in this food, but the majority is honey. So under normal circumstances, majority would play a role and primary would play a role. But here, because it's flour, it's because it's the grits, because it's a grain, actually the grain is going to be the main thing. And you would recite a bracha barimina mezainis. Even though I must say there is one opinion that argues, Rav Yehuda. And Rav Yehuda says shahakol. He would say that it's shahakol because the main thing is the honey. Why is the main thing the honey? Well, possibly the case is talking about the honey is the majority, and that's mainly. Second point might be the main purpose why you want to eat it, mainly the honey. You also want the sustenance part, but the main thing is the honey, because you love honey, and you mainly want the honey. But the fact is, so Rav Yehuda says it's shahakol, but Rav Kahana says it's mezainos. And Rav and Shmuel seem to be along the same lines, because they also tell us anything that has from the grains, automatically mezainos. Don't even we don't care about the rules of primary and secondary. It gets the bracha mezainos. Of course, we'll talk a little more about this. One of the things that we're going to mention is the bracha on licorice. Licorice is a very big question. What is the bracha on licorice? Licorice has a little flour in it. And the little flour in it is questionable if it's there for texture, for flavor, or just to bind the sugar and colored sugar together. If it's there just to bind, just as a binding agent, if the flour is there just to hold it together, that is the exception to the rule, that something that's only there to bind together would be shahakol, if it's even flour. But anything, if it's not to bind, if it's for texture, for flavor, for anything else, it would be mezainos. So the question is, what is the purpose of the flour and licorice? And I don't know if anyone knows, even the people who created licorice, I don't know if they know exactly what their purpose was. They just know it sold very well and they continue to produce it. Yes, Ezra.
Well, if flour appears in the ingredients as the first item, then that would automatically make it mezonot.
I would
But if
think
it
so.
well,
I would
I
think so.
mean,
Yeah, I agree.
yeah,
I would think
but
so.
if it
Generally.
appears like the 6th or 7th or 8th ingredient down the road, then the expectation is that maybe it is a binder and it's not the main. So therefore it'd be whatever, it would be a shackle in that case.
Right. The only thing is, I don't know. That's a general, what you're saying is more of a general rule. So each case you would need to judge it. It could be licorice, flour is the first ingredient. I'm not sure. Because it might need a lot of flour to hold it together. It's very watery, I guess, but I mean, I know there's a lot of people who recite a bracha shahako on licorice. I disagree. I personally think licorice, the flour, is a main ingredient, not just a binder. I think people like the chew, the hard chew, and the the texture of it. But many opinions say that the bracha should be shahakol. So I'm not really sure what to say, but that is one of the things that we are learning about right here is how much flour, how does it play a role in the bracha, even if it's either a small amount or it's not the main part of it, and so on. Does the bracha change or not? Okay, we'll have to stop here. Have a wonderful day.
Rabbi,
yes,
I just wanted to say that when you're talking about grits, I think you're translating like pounded grain or grains.
Yes.
Because
is that wrong?
because actual grits is corn.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I have to change that. Oh, thank you for correcting me.
Pounded grain.
I meant the type of grinding, but you're right. Okay, so we have to. Oh, okay. So I take that back then. We can't translate grits as corn because there's no the bracha would definitely not be mezainis on corn. Corn is not one of the grains. So I mean flour that's I mean wheat that's pounded and not ground, and it's not. It's a certain texture that it has, but it's not flour, and that's what we're discussing here. But it's made from one of the grains, wheat or any of the other grains. Okay, thank you for correcting me, David. I didn't know, I translated that wrong. Okay, have a good day, everyone. Sei gesund.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Stay safe,
Thank you,
everybody.
Rabbi.